Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I expected to end up in a ball of fire on the edge of the runway. I kind of shook my head and the airplane hit the ground, bounced, and as I opened my eyes again, I'm about 30 degrees off the heading nut and flying away. And I expected to be dead at that time.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Flying at high speed and at low level, Royal Canadian Air Force pilot Alan French was at the sharp end of potential nuclear bombing missions during the Cold War. Alan delves into his early inspirations and the pivotal moments that led him to join the Air Forces himself. From training on the Canadair CT-114 Tutor to flying the iconic F-86 Sabre and the CF104 Starfighter, Alan shares first-hand accounts of Cold War tensions and the challenges of high-speed, low-level navigation across Europe. Around 50% of over 200 Canadian Starfighters were lost in accidents. You'll hear about Alan's near-death experience at a West German airbase and many other personal anecdotes that bring Cold War history to life. I'm delighted to welcome Alan French to our Cold War conversation.
I was born in 1946, so I'm a typical baby boomer. My mom and dad served together my mom wasn't in, but my dad was in the Royal Canadian Air Force during the war. And even though they served the whole time in Canada, they elected not to have a family until after the war. So I'm probably the leading edge of the baby boomers. So I was always inspired by my dad. His Air Force service. He was an engine technician and served on the south coast of Nova Scotia, servicing the cancels that covered the North American side of the convoys going to and from Britain during the war. So they were able to cover the ships coming out of New York and also out of Halifax. So my dad his experience during the war being stationed in Canada was pretty mellow. And he had a lot of good stories about the war. So I was pretty inspired by them. And in the 50s, when I was just kind of approaching my teenage years, Canada had this fighter on the drawing board that was actually rolling into production. The Avro Aero, the CF105. I don't know whether you recall that or not.
I'm aware of the controversy.
Yes, exactly. So, well, I won't go into that then if you're aware of it. But basically, it was canceled for a number of reasons, some of which are real and some of which are probably, let's call them conspiracy theories. But my dad was incensed by the whole decision to cancel that project. As you know, it was probably the most advanced fighter anywhere in the world for its time, but it never got into full production. So I was pretty impressed by that. And of course, that's about the point where the Cold War changed from defense to deterrence. You know, the theory then was that the Soviet bomber is no longer a threat. So what's the point in having a big fighter fleet to intercept all these Soviet bombers if they're going to use ICBMs? Sputnik had just flown, and that was a sea change in strategy. So the whole concept of strategic warfare in those days changed from defense to deterrence. So when it came time for me to consider joining the Air Force, I joined after a stint in the Air Cadets where I got my private pilot license. I joined the Air Force at 17 years old and went through pilot training. Probably.
What year was that you
joined the Air Force in 1965? So I was
okay.
At that time, I was just on the cusp of turning 18. So I actually had to get my parents' permission at 17 to join the Air Force. And that was a given. And so I went through my pilot training on the Tutor. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but it's an airplane that's much like the jet provost. You know, it's a side-by-side seating trainer. That was kind of a new design at those times. The side-by-side fighters, the Americans had one, and the T-37, and the RAF had one, and the jet provost and Canada had one that was home built and home designed in the Tutor. Then I did my advanced training up until wings on the T-33.
So that's the shooting star, commonly known.
Exactly, yes. And I was never really confident in being able to finish the course because the attrition rate was so high. Out of maybe 50 people that would be selected at the recruiting center, I think ultimately there were 5 of us got our wings on jets. Some went transport, some went navigator, that kind of thing. But at the end of the Tutor training, this squadron leader Keating called me into his office, and he was a World War II vet. He had a Distinguished Flying Cross. He had done a tour or two on F-86 Sabres in Europe at that time, and he was now the commander of the basic flying school in Gimli, Manitoba. And he called me into his office, and he said, "Well, Cadet French, what you're about to graduate, and we split the stream here. Some pilots go on multi-engine training, and some go on to fly fighters. And what is your preference?" And I said, "Well, sir, still not being confident in being able to finish the course, I wanted to amass as much multi-engine time as I could so I could get my commercial pilot license and go on to be a commercial pilot." And I said, "Well, sir, I want to go on multi-engine and fly transports." And he looked me in the eye and he said, "No, Cadet French," he said, "you want to be a fighter pilot." So at this point, I'm actually quite astounded because, here's Squadron Leader Keating, Distinguished Flying Cross, and he wants me to join this really exclusive club of fighter pilots. And I'm actually astounded by this statement out of his mouth. So anyway, long story short, I went on to fly the T-33 and got my wings, and then went on to briefly fly the F-86 Sabre jet for 65 hours as a fighter lead-in training, and then went on to the OTU, the Operational Training Unit at Cold Lake, on Starfighters.
So why were you not confident you were going to pass the course?
Just because the attrition rate was so high, and you never really got a clue. The way I tackled the whole course was there was always a next hurdle. You never looked right at the ultimate goal. I mean, the ultimate goal was out there, but you're always focused on the next hurdle. The next test, and so I never really got a feeling that there was all these obstacles in front of me before the final goal, and I wasn't that confident that I could get through all of them without stumbling somewhere. But
yeah, was your ultimate aim to fly civil, or were you just considering that could be an option for you?
No, that was
once you finished.
No, that was definitely my backup plan. And yeah, no, I wanted to be an Air Force pilot, so that was the number one.
What did your dad say when you told him that you were going to be flying Starfighter?
I don't think he knew very much about the program. What the Starfighter was doing at that time was not common knowledge in Canada. Nobody really, the fact that we're involved in the nuclear weapons program with the Americans was not common knowledge in Canada. The Starfighters were equipped to deliver nuclear weapons, and so were the CF104 Voodoos, the air defense aircraft as well. But so my dad really didn't have much of a clue what I was going to be getting into.
So he must have been very proud that you'd passed and you were going to be a fighter pilot.
He was just beaming at my wings parade. It was quite a treat to have him there.
What about your mum? Was she worried that you were going to be flying frontline?
Not really. No, she, the war was over, and we were all kind of basking in the peace dividend. Even though there was the duck and cover commercials on TV about nuclear warfare and all that kind of stuff. But that was kind of an abstract, not a real threat. It was just kind of out there.
At what age were you when you moved to the operational training unit for Star?
I finished the F-86. I finished the F-86 training in my 20s. Now that was a moment, Ian, I got to tell you about, because when I grew up, my Top Gun inspirational movie was The Hunters. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie with Robert Mitchum and Richard Egan and Robert Wagner. They were flying F-86s in Korea. And
not familiar with that.
oh yeah, you got to see that. It's a better movie than Top Gun, actually. But that was my inspiration as well. That was my Top Gun movie. And so when you got to the F-86 transition unit, the fighter transition unit, you went through ground school and you went through the simulator training. And what they did, and they never made a two-seat F-86. So the instructor would take you out to the airplane, sit you in the cockpit, and they'd put a blindfold on you. And he'd call out the name of switches, and you had to find that switch blindfolded and operate it. And if you were successful in passing the blindfold test, he'd pat you on the back and he said, "Okay, where you go. If you come back, you're checked out." And so off you go on your first trip in an F-86. And of course, I'm looking back there, and it's this bubble canopy, and you've got three 350 caliber machine guns on each side of your just outboard of your knees, and these swept wings. I mean, this is a real fighter. Anyway, I go out, I swan around for an hour, and I land, and I taxi back into the line, and I shut down the engine. And of course, there's that moment when you shut down a jet engine where everything's cooling down, and you can hear this clicking and pinging, and the metal just, cooling off. And I'm sitting there, and I said to myself, wow, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? That was my whole bucket list. Anyway, I did go on, finish the F-86 training, got up to Cold Lake, and started going on the course. I think one of the reasons I was selected for that whole program was on the Tutor. We did nav training, and part of the nav training was, of course, IFR cross countries, and some of it was medium level navs, and then some of it was low level navigation. And I really excelled in the low level navigation. I was a pretty good map reader, and I was always over the target, right, within 10 seconds at least. As a matter of fact, I had a challenge on with my instructor, and he said, okay, if you're over 10 seconds off on your time on target, you owe me a beer. I said, okay, sir, but you owe me a beer for every second I'm under 10 seconds. And I won way more of a beer than he did. So
that sounds like a good incentive as well.
Anyway, so I guess that's the reason Squadron Leader Keating selected me for fighter training, and of course went on to the 104, which at that point was being used as a low-level stealth strike attack aircraft. Canadair built 200 or so of the CF104 Starfighters in Canada under license from Lockheed. And then we also had 20 of the TF, the dual versions, the CF104Ds. They were built by Lockheed in Burbank, California.
How different was the Starfighter to any of the other jet aircraft that you'd flown?
Well, I think the biggest difference, of course, is the speed. It's at least 30% faster on the takeoff and landings, and just the ground handling. If you're doing a flapless approach in that airplane, your minimum speed on final is 230 knots. So it's more like a space shuttle approach in that configuration. Of course, it had other lift augmenting devices like the boundary layer controller and leading edge flaps and everything else that would bring it down to a more probably reasonable speed. So a normal landing would be around 175 knots, which is still quite a bit faster than most other aircraft. Take the Hornet, for example. The F-18 is around 140 knots. The T-33, you were crossing the fence at 105. So it's quite a leap in reaction time, and of course the brakes were very small. You also had a hook if you happen to have to abort a takeoff, or if you had brake failure. But you also had a drag chute. So those were all things that helped out in the ground. But also the aircraft had some quirky flying characteristics that caused you to really get into trouble fast. And one of them was the very small wing, of course. And with the high G tail, it had the typical blanking out the tail scenario in high angles of attack, where you could actually pitch up and lose control of your pitch in that situation. If you got up to a very high angle of attack, you could pitch up and go out of control. So those were things that a Sprague, a student pilot, or a brand new pilot had to watch out for. And I was probably one of the first courses, not the first course, but probably among the first, what we call pipeliners.
It's one of those aircraft that you can't mistake for any other aircraft, really. I think I've had one pilot describe it as but more like flying a rocket than an aircraft.
Well, it was. It had an immense amount of power in. When you got it going Mach 2, it was just getting going. I mean, it would have gone a lot faster. I mean, aerodynamically, and it was not thrust limited. It was like a racehorse, that you had to rein back at Mach 2. The limitation was not the power or the airframe. It was the compressor inlet temperature. Once that reached to 121 degrees Celsius, it was a slow light came on the instrument panel, and that was your speed limit. So still one of the fastest airplanes in the world today. Guys with no other previous operational experience coming off training and going on to this really kind of challenging airplane. And so it was, I won't say it was an experiment, but it was unusual for first tour pilots to go on that airplane at the time I was going on.
Can you remember your first solo flight?
No, I can't actually. I can't recall that. But by that time you were a fairly experienced pilot, and you had this F-86 and T-33 time under your belt. You probably got 4 or 5 hours dual, and then they'd send you up on a solo trip, and it was. I don't remember it as being that unusual. The second trip, they gave you a clean airplane, and of course that was the big one. You took it up to 35,000 feet, and you went out and you did a Mach 2 run, and so that was your second solo trip. So that was kind of interesting. But that time, the only time I'd ever been supersonic before was in a vertical dive in an F-86.
Yeah, because the Starfighter has somewhat of a reputation.
Yeah, it does,
for being challenging to fly. And I know the West Germans had quite a high accident rate.
Yeah, it's like anything, Ian. It depends on how you look at the stats and how you parse the numbers. But the Germans bought, I think, 600 of their airplanes, and they lost 200. The Canadians bought, 220. And we lost over 50%. So
wow.
We lost over 100 airplanes. And it was mainly due to the role that we were flying them in. It was, low level, and you're down in bird territory, and it's a single engine airplane. So if you have a bird strike, you're going to lose the airplane, and you take a bird in the engine. And of course, we're in a low level role, so you're down there weaving amongst the hills, and sometimes in very low visibility. In Europe in those days, everything was coal-fired electrical plants, and so a good visibility day over there was maybe 5 or 6 kilometers. And a lot of the times we were just, blundering around in the murk at 450 and 540 knots.
So, at what point do they start talking to you about the nuclear mission?
Obviously, when you got to Cold Lake, that's when your big security clearance kicked right in. And of course, that's when you really found out about what the mission was all about. Up until that time, you knew what you were going to be doing. You knew you were going to be in the nuclear strike role, but you didn't know anything about it. And then when you got up there, it became a little more real, because you're looking at, delivery parameters. You're actually looking at mission folders, and now you're finding out what your target's going to be, and that kind of thing. And it became certainly more real, but it was still, because it was far-fetched for anybody. It was kind of unthinkable that people would start flinging nukes around. So that was the whole point of mutually assured destruction. So it was still more of an abstract concept.
Yeah, but you gotta be ready to fly that mission.
Yes, and I think I don't know about anybody else on the course, and we really never really talked that much about it between ourselves. But I think everybody had to make the personal decision about, or it had to have the, had to think about what they were going to do personally and how to reconcile the whole idea of, when the siren goes off, you're going to launch off and head east, and there's a good chance you're not going to be coming back, or at least if you did come back, there's probably not going to be much to come back to. So I certainly had that in my mind, and I guess one of the rationales for reconciling that whole idea to myself was that I was being a part of this deterrent force, and somebody had to do it.
I guess it's sort of knowing this isn't a conventional weapon. This is something that's going to have a lot of collateral damage if you drop it.
Yeah. And I suppose you looked at it like a Lancaster crew would have looked at it in World War II. If the siren goes off, there's nothing that I can't think about that. It's just it's a job.
In Canada, you're also trained around how you're going to deliver the weapon as well. So was it lobbed or was it a low-level release? I mean, how was the weapon actually delivered to the target?
Well, we actually had different types of weapons. Some could be, some you could do a lay down. You could come in low level and lay it down right on the target. Of course, you don't have to get that close with nukes, do you? But the other one was you would pull up and level off and do what we called an EMR, an estimated manual release. So you actually, rather than using fancy sightings, you actually just pulled up, leveled off at 1,500 feet, and when the target went by the canopy thruster, you press the bomb release button, and off it went. The other and the most common release method that we used was called the LAD, Lima Alpha Delta Delta, stands for Low Altitude Drogue Delivery. And you would, if you were visual, you would come in as low as you could, probably 50 to 100 feet above ground, going 500, going Mach 0.85, and you would go over your initial point, some sort of geographic reference point that would be a certain distance back from the target, and you would press the bomb release button. That would start a timer. Was called the run-in timer, and so you had that pre-programmed for a certain number of seconds, and once that run-in timer ran out, a tone would go off in your headset, and you would pull 3.5 G up to a 45-degree angle. And when the release timer ran out, the bomb would come off the aircraft, and a parachute would open on the bomb, you hope, and the bomb would float down to its pre-programmed detonation altitude. And you could have it set for an air burst or a ground burst or whatever. And as the bomb released off the airplane, you would roll inverted, 45 degrees nose up, and pull down to, with 20 or 30 degree descent angle, roll level again, roll upright. And when you got to your escape altitude, you would head out level at that point. Now, this was in full afterburner that you did this. And at the point of pull up, you actually reached back, and there was a lead foiled shield. I don't know whether you've ever seen a blind flying hood in, where you practiced instrument flying in the backseat. So this looked like that. It looked like a blind flying hood. But the pilot, you talk about multitasking, but as you're pulling up at 3.5 G and getting up to a 45-degree angle, you would reach back and grab a handle on this thing, and you'd slide this thing over your head, this lead foil shield, to protect you from the radiation and the flash blindness. And so this whole recovery procedure, where the bomb came off at a 45-degree climb angle, you roll inverted and pull down to your escape altitude in full afterburner and start heading away. This was all done on instruments.
Wow. And how long were you told you had before it detonated?
They told us that we would probably be going about Mach 1.5, and we'd be about 14 or 15 miles away from the bomb when it detonated, going the other way. So, there was a good thought that we could survive the actual blast. But you got to keep in mind that you're not the only guy up there. There's all kinds of other airplanes doing the same thing, probably in close proximity if you're all going after tactical targets on the front line. So you could easily run afoul of somebody else's fragging load.
And I guess there's a danger that while you're coming in, another nuke may go off, perhaps some distance away, but blind you. Was there any protection against that?
Yes, you probably know that the RAF in that role, they actually used an eye patch. They had an eye patch over one eye, which would prevent you from going blind and that nuclear flash went off in proximity. We actually had a gold-plated visor, like the astronauts use on their spacesuits.
Mm-hmm.
And so our alert helmets would be fitted with this gold-plated visor, and so we would wear that in a combat zone. We would have that visor down.
It's probably a bit more pleasant than an iPad.
Well, it was. So I don't know how effective it would be. I would imagine it would provide a goodly amount of protection, but maybe not quite as effective as a welder's goggles, but the same sort of idea.
When you were in Canada, were you told what your targets were there, or was it only once you'd arrived in Europe?
Only once we arrived in Europe, and of course that information was the most closely guarded, top secret material as well. So none of that would have been available to us in Canada. It was only actually when we were in the nuclear alert compound that information was available.
And can you describe your journey to Europe? Because starfighters are presumably sent in cargo planes or ships.
Yeah, they take the wings off planes and they would take them over in the C-130s. And they actually went to Scottish Aviation in Prestwick in Scotland, where they were assembled and then ferried to the bases in Germany.
What base did you fly into in Germany?
My first posting in Germany was in Zweibrücken, which is along the southern border with France, actually just north of Metz. So in that area. It's kind of at the intersection of the Moselle and the Rhine River. So some of the best white wine area in the world.
Yeah, probably not bad beer there either as well.
Oh, it was good beer as well. So when I arrived in Germany, it was just after my 21st birthday. So when I got there in January of 1968, and I just turned 21 in December 1967. And so I was just old enough to drink, and so here I am. I'm a nuclear bomb commander, and just past the threshold of being able to drink and vote. And
I think in Europe, certainly in the UK, it's 18. It could even be younger in some of the other European countries. But incredible. And had you been to Europe before or not?
I had not. No, Germany was a new experience for me, and it was quite fun to me, And of course, it was only 20 years after the war at that point too. So it was, we were still looked upon by some of the older folks as occupiers. They were survivors of the war. So I know as I was over there, I spent almost 6 years over there on and off, and the attitude towards NATO troops, actually, you can see it change while I was there. We went from occupiers to actual allies while we were over there. The Canadians lived out on the economy mostly. We rented our quarters from the Germans rather than having a great big complex on base like the Americans did. Yeah, it was quite a pleasant experience ultimately in interacting with the German civilians for me.
The nuclear weapons you were dropping were American, so Canada didn't have their own nuclear weapons.
No, it was it would have been quite a convoluted political process to actually get the authorization going to do that. So I don't think it was going to happen in 15 minutes, which was what we were. We were on 15-minute alert there. We were on QRA rather than the Zulu alert. with just 5 minutes. So our time to be airborne was 15 minutes. But there was no way you could go through the political machinations to have a Canadian release of to do a strike and get the American release at the same time. That would all have to happen before time, and probably days and weeks. Go through these different DEFCON levels, and so by the time you're ready to ring the bell and have the siren go off, all that hopefully would have been completed beforehand. So the actual physical way of controlling that was we had the aircraft, the loaded aircraft, were sitting inside concrete revetments. And normally each squadron had 2 airplanes on alert at all times. And then you could bring the whole wing up to nuclear capable, in a few hours' notice. But we always had 4 airplanes on alert, and 3 wing, and the other wing as well. So we were ready to go in 15 minutes. Yeah, the way it worked was we had these loaded airplanes inside these revetments, and you had a Canadian military policeman sitting on the left-hand corner of the hangar, and he's in this little guard shack. And we had an American military policeman sitting on the right-hand corner. And those 2 guys were in little, the typical little guard shacks. And the Canadian got released every 2 hours. The poor American, he had to do an 8-hour shift in that little phone booth the whole time. So I always felt sorry for him. So when we came out in the morning on the shift change, you'd go in and talk to the other pilot, and you'd go through a bit of a relief checklist where you'd go through things and make sure everything was in order. And then you would go out with your armorer, and the 2 of you would march out to the aircraft, which had a yellow line painted around it. And inside that line was the no loan zone. So nobody was allowed to be in that zone by themselves. It always had to be monitored by another competent person. So there's no chance of sabotaging the operation. So we'd go out there, and the American guard would come out of his shack, and he would fall in step with us, and we'd all step across the line together. And then I would do the walk around on the airplane and the bomb, and I would check the bomb settings, and I would climb up into the cockpit, leaving my hands up on top of the windshield rail, where the American guard and my armorer could see them. And then the armorer would climb up on the ladder, and then he could monitor my actions in the cockpit. So I would go down and do the switch settings. I'd look through my survival pack and make sure the gold sovereigns and the East European currency and the escape and evasion maps, they were all there, that kind of thing. And then I would, again, put my hands up on the canopy rail. The weapons technician would get off the ladder. I would climb out, and we'd all march out of the no loan zone in lockstep. And when we crossed the yellow line, the American would go back to his guard shack, and my weapons tech and myself would go off to the alert shack for the rest of the day.
So when you were on alert, the aircraft didn't have a weapon attached to it at that point,
yep,
unless there'd been a build-up to some form of tension.
No, that's not true, Ian. What we had was 4 airplanes. Each squadron had 2 airplanes loaded at all times. They were loaded with nuclear weapons all times, 24/7.
So how did that agreement from the Canadian government to actually allow the Royal Canadian Air Force to go ahead and fly those missions?
Well, for the Canadian release, all it was the siren. If the siren went off, we were gone. But obviously we couldn't go out. We couldn't go without the American release. So that was a little bit different. And 60 years have passed, so I'm sure that none of the Official Secrets Act doesn't apply anymore. But there were several ways we could get the actual release. We could actually get the code on a piece of paper from the American Emergency Action Officer. We could actually get it over the radio, or we could actually arm the bomb manually with the switch settings before we got in the airplane. So there were a number of ways of getting that released. The Americans could pre-release it and just wait for the Canadian authorization. as far as we were concerned, we needed two things. We needed the siren to go off, and we needed that piece of paper to arm the bomb. Or we needed the code. So how we got it was another story.
Presumably you did practice scrambles.
Yes, we did.
How regular were those? Were they like?
Pretty regular. I think they would rotate in and out of queue about once a week, and at each squadron. So there would probably be a practice scramble going on maybe every couple of days. So what they would do is when they were changing the aircraft out, they would tow a new aircraft into the QRA compound, and they would load it with a nuclear weapon. They would download the other one that was going off duty, and then they would probably, once that airplane was unloaded, they would scramble it out of the queue, just as a practice.
And when the practice sounded, did you know it was a practice?
Yeah.
At that point?
Yeah, we were forewarned, that this is the drill.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So there, when you look at it, there were lots of safeguards.
With a weapon like that, they're going to make sure there's check and counter check, and
absolutely.
The last thing you want is some maverick flying off with a nuke attached.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. So anyway, I spent roughly two years in a bit. They closed the base at Zweibrücken while I was there, and they amalgamated the Canadian units into two bases. And we ended up having two squadrons in Lahr, down in southern Germany, in the Schwarzwald, in the Black Forest. And then also we had another Canadian base at Baden-Solingen, along the Rhine River, just across the border from Strasbourg and Alsace. So when Zweibrücken closed, the squadron I was on was moved down to Lahr. And so I spent another year and a half down there in Lahr before I was posted back to Cold Lake as an instructor on the OTU.
And at Lahr, you were still in the nuclear role there?
That's correct, yeah. Actually, at that point, we had a new prime minister. It was Trudeau's, or present prime minister's father. And he was not a fan of Canada being involved in nuclear weapons. So he announced to NATO that we were getting out of the nuclear weapons business, which shot a big hole in our credibility as a NATO force, but announced that we were going to switch over to the conventional attack role. Well, as you probably know, the wings on a Starfighter are pretty short, and there's not too many hard points on a Starfighter, and we didn't have the gun installed at that point, so there was no M61 Gatling gun on the airplane. That came later. We had an extra fuel tank in there to extend our range for the nuclear strike. So I was involved, when I went back to Cold Lake, I was involved in transition training over to the conventional attack role rather than the nuclear strike role. And that was pretty interesting times.
I just want to go back to Germany before we talk about that. Well, when you get to Germany, you're told what your targets are. Where were they located?
Well, no, it's interesting. I don't want to ruffle feathers, but I'll give you a story. Later on, when I was embarked on my next career, which was as an airline pilot, I'm sitting down on a beach in Baja California, in Mexico, and with some of the crew. And the lead flight attendant on the aircraft was a gentleman named Tibor Friedrich, a Czechoslovakian, and he was telling me the story of how he escaped from Czechoslovakia during the 1968 Czech Prague Spring. And I happened to be over there. It was a time of tension. It was a little bit of a time of tension with NATO. But anyway, he was in the Czech army at that time, and he managed to make his way to the Austrian border and went under the fence, and subsequently made his way back over to Canada and joined the same airline as I was flying for. And I just said, well, where were you based in Czechoslovakia? And he said, and he gave me the name of this army base in Czechoslovakia. And I said, I was one of my targets. So, here we are years later, probably 15 years later, two of us sitting on on the beach. And, if circumstances had been different, neither one of us would probably have been there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I did an interview with a US F111 pilot, and he was flying Pan Am into Berlin in a later career. And as he's flying in, he thinks, hang on, I recognize this layout. And it was the airfield he was flying over was one of his targets.
Yes.
In the F111.
It is a surreal experience. I know I went and had lunch with my old boss at this golf course over in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And I told him about, I said I'd done a Danube River cruise. And when named some of the places that I went to, and he said, did you get up close and personal with some of your old targets? And I said, "This, as a matter of fact, I did, sir." So, climbed up on a hill, and there was this old castle that used to be a Warsaw Pact Russian Army headquarters, and that was one of the targets. So it was a bit of a weird feeling, actually running my hands over the walls and saying, if the siren had gone off 45 years ago or 50 years ago, we would have turned this place into glass.
Were you rehearsing just for one target, or were you rehearsing for? So if you got to scramble on Wednesday, was your target different? Did you have to rehearse for different targets?
You had whatever target your airplane was assigned to, so it could be different. There was a target folder in the QRA compound. That's probably the first thing. The first thing you did was go out and accept the airplane. And, you'd look at the mission folder that was inside the airplane, and you could see what your target was. But when you came back into the QRA compound, you'd have a cup of coffee and go into the safe and take the target folder out. And that would probably your next 3 or 4 hours would be spent studying the target, where the enemy defenses were, routes, salient checkpoints, what it was going to look like on radar, that kind of thing. So that was kind of what your day was taken up with. But you could have different targets depending on the airplane you were assigned.
Understood. You're having to navigate at low level, at high speed in Europe, where it's misty, rainy, hills, woods, all sorts. I mean, how challenging was it doing that sort of navigation versus what you'd trained on in Canada?
Well, Canada was a little bit different than Europe. Obviously, in northern Alberta, we don't have the hills and the weather that you have in Europe. It's pretty flat terrain, and the visibility is normally pretty good. But the challenge there was there are millions and millions of lakes. And so, if you're out more than 7 or 8 seconds on your time, you could be over a whole different body of water, and it's a different way of navigation. So we navigated by lake patterns and basically just time and heading in northern Canada until you got to a recognizable, a big enough water feature that would be unmistakable. And then that's the way you navigated in Alberta, and Saskatchewan. But in Europe, the only reliable landmarks were tree patterns. The historical medieval forests and tree lines and tree patterns, those places almost never changed. So if you had a tree pattern on a map, that was probably your most reliable checkpoint. And of course, railroads and rivers were other big checkpoints, but there were a lot more of those in Europe than we were used to in northern Canada, and so it was easy to get yourself confused. So the challenges of navigating at high speed in both places were there, but they were different. They were slightly different. One of the things that we did have, if the visibility was good enough, you navigated at low level. Obviously, we didn't go down to as low an altitude as we could in northern Canada. We were navigating at treetop level in northern Canada, but in overpopulated area like Germany, we had to be respectful of, at least somewhat respectful of the noise. So our minimum altitude for visual navigation in Germany was 500 feet. And, obviously in a combat situation, you'd try and get much lower than that. The one thing that we did have, if we ran into visibility where we didn't feel comfortable sustaining that and we knew hills were ahead or whatever, we had these minimum safe altitudes on the side of our strip maps. And so if you got into bad visibility, you pulled up and you flew on instruments at roughly 1,500 feet above ground. And you would follow the track on instruments, and that would theoretically clear the hills ahead. And it was also deconflict you from other airspace, other restricted airspace, like, tower control zones and that kind of stuff. So that was all deconflicted. One of the advantages that we did have, and this is kind of a unique Canadian invention, was one of our navigators, who was now in a mission planning role, was down skiing in the French Alps, and he was sitting there by the fireplace with a glass of brandy and looking up at the wall, and they had this 3D relief map of the French Alps on the wall, and there was a light on the other corner of the room, and this light was casting shadows over the relief map. And he said, this source of light could be exactly the same as a radar beam. And so we can use those shadows on those hills as a radar prediction. So that's what he did. They made these relief maps of Europe, and they would take this light and drive it across this relief map at a scale altitude and take vertical pictures of the shadows. And that strip of shadows would go on the side of our mission folder, our map. And we could actually go on the left-hand side of the page and navigate on radar using those predictive shadows. And they were quite good. So, but this became the standard package for Canadian low-level navigation in Europe. And I don't know whether any other NATO nations picked it up. I hadn't heard, but it certainly was a useful tool for us.
That sounds like a really neat idea. So you're talking strip maps. So the map is just one long map that you're working with.
It's actually like a booklet and you would fold the pages towards you as you went along.
Got it.
So it was quite easy to use, and the emergency safe altitudes were posted on each page. So as you went along the strip, you'd have an emergency safe altitude that would be annotated on the page. So if you lost a visual contact, you could climb up to that immediately. That killed at least a couple of guys. There was one theory that somebody was navigating along and he climbed up to an emergency relief altitude, and he had his thumb over the next one, and he missed it. He missed a 1,000-foot climb, and he went into a hill right at the emergency safe altitude that was on the previous page. So, yeah, we operated the aircraft over in Europe for roughly 30 years before the CF-18 Hornets came in the early 1980s. And during that time, I think we lost 39 pilots to various things, some couple of mid-airs and lots of flying into the ground, some bird, that kind of thing. Some very, very, very few. I can think of maybe 2 or 3 that were attributable to aircraft malfunctions, but most of them were mission related. Not the fault of the aircraft. So the airplane got the reputation, but it really was the mission.
In your time, did you have any times where you thought, whoa, that was really close, I might not have made it back from that?
Well, there was just one, actually. The airplane was, I ended up with 1,500 hours on the airplane. And it was always really good to me. I was quite comfortable with it. There was only one incident where it jumped up and bit me, and that was we were doing a NATO cross-training servicing exercise into a German Air Force base in Bavaria, just outside of Munich. And so 2 starfighters went out, and we did a low-level nav mission, and we were to do a no-notice recovery at a German Air Force base. And that's where you just arrive, and you give this call sign that tells them, yeah, we're arriving. We're going to land. You have to turn us around in a half an hour, and then we're going to leave. And so that was kind of a cross-servicing exercise that NATO had going. So as I was landing in this German Air Force base, there were two flap settings on the Starfighter. And so you had takeoff flap, which give you 15 degrees on the leading edge, 15 degrees on the trailing edge. So that was half flap. And then land flap was 30 degrees on the leading edge, I think, and 40 degrees or 45 degrees on the trailing edge. And on the trailing edge, when you went from half flap to full flap, the aircraft had a system of ductwork that went along the upper edge of the trailing edge flap, and it would bleed air off the compressor and blow it down over the flap. It's called boundary layer control. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it was quite a unique high lift device. And so what it would do would keep the airflow attached at the low angles of attack and high flap settings. So it allowed you to lower your landing speed by at least 15 knots or so, or probably more. But as I was on short final, maybe 300 to 500 feet above ground, I went from half flap to full flap, and the airplane immediately rolled inverted. And I thank God for the instructor that told me that when you move control, you leave your hand on it and move it back. If it's not doing what you want, move it back to other selection. So I did that. I moved my hand from land flap back to takeoff flap, back to half flap. And of course, the roll rate stopped again, but now I'm upside down. I'm too low to reject, and I'm heading for the ground. So I lit the afterburner, started rolling the airplane the other way. I expected to end up in a ball of fire on the edge of the runway. I kind of shook my head, and the airplane hit the ground, bounced, and I shook my head, and I'm about 30 degrees, as I opened my eyes again, I'm about 30 degrees off the heading that I had touched the ground at, and flying away. And I kind of shook my head. And I expected to be dead at that time. My last thought was, I was a single guy then. And my last thought was, my poor mother. And so anyway, I went by the tower and left the landing gear down, and flew by, and they told me everything looked okay on the gear. So I came in and landed using half flap. And we had a look at the airplane, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. And so I phoned back to Sabre and talked to my boss. And he said, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with the airplane. Just bring it back. But he said, the only one should use half flap. And I said, yes, sir. Obviously, wasn't planning on doing anything else. But, I think given my airline experience and everything else, I probably would have made a different decision today. But this was the military, and he was a wing commander, and I was a flying officer. And so I just said, yes, sir. But I still had an ejection seat and a parachute, so your risk assessment is a little bit different than it would be on an airliner or something else. Anyway, flew back to Zweibrücken, landed. The engineering officer was there. My boss was there. We took a walk around the airplane. Still couldn't see anything wrong. And one of the airmen that was out there with us said, hey, come on over and look at this. And he was over on the right-hand side of the aircraft. And he pointed out that there were 6 inches missing off the right-hand tip tank. So I had hit the left main wheel on the edge of the runway, or maybe just off the edge of the runway. And the airplane bounced and scraped 6 inches off the right-hand tip tank before I got airborne again. So that was my first brush. I was probably 21 or 22 years old. That was probably my first brush with mortality. That's where I realized that I was not bulletproof.
Wow. I mean, and the next day you've just got to get in an aircraft again and do the same thing.
Yeah. Which I don't recall really being a problem for me. That wasn't, I had a lot of faith in the airplane, and, these things were one off, and it was just it happened in probably the worst possible position. that close to the ground, and it wasn't a 0-0 seat like they have today. You had to be going not 90 knots straight and level or an upward trajectory before the ejection seat would work. It would safely give you enough altitude and speed to have a good parachute opening.
You mentioned earlier, Alan, about escape and evasion equipment.
Yeah.
What was the training like for escape and evasion?
I never actually went through the E&E course. I know some of my compatriots actually did, and I know that our mentors and our predecessors on the F-86, they actually had to go through a full escape and evasion course where they would take them out. The army would try and chase them down, and you would always get captured because that was the end of the scenario. That was part of the course, and then they would put you through an interrogation type of deal as well. We actually never had to do that. So basically, our escape and evasion training was they gave you a silk map of the area that you could actually wear around your chest, and you had some local currency and some gold sovereigns. And the idea was not to bail out over enemy territory. The idea was to do that escape maneuver and head west as fast as you could, and either find a place to land or maybe land on the Autobahn if you wanted to. But probably the most likely scenario was once you got to an area where it looked fairly reasonable, then you ran out of fuel or were thereabouts, so you would just pull the handle and bail out. Escape and evasion was a vague concept because generally, in the back of your mind, you're pretty much viewed it as a one-way mission.
That's common with most people with the nuclear role. You'd fly till the fuel ran out, or more likely you were going to get shot down before you really got...
Or get caught in somebody else's blast.
Yeah. Did you meet any of the other NATO air forces?
Yeah, one of the things that we did quite often was we'd go on squadron exchanges. And, you would see, usually with another Starfighter unit, and we got to see how some of the other NATO forces were using the airplane in a completely different role. I'm thinking of a 322 squadron, which is a Dutch Air Force squadron. They were based in Leeuwarden in Holland, and they specialized in high altitude interception. So they actually sat 5-minute alert in spacesuits. So they were pressurized. It couldn't have been a very comfortable way of sitting on alert. They regularly did practiced interceptions, up in the 70,000 foot plus region. They would do snap.
Wow. They
would go up there and intercept and do snap ups into that region to try and shoot down high altitude incursions. It was a really different role for the Starfighter. It's actually probably closer to what the airplane was designed for. But of course, I think its best iteration was as a stealth low-level bomber.
So after serving in Europe, you said you returned to Canada and was an instructor on the conventional role.
So we were converting over to things like snake eye bombs, to the retarded bombs or the slick bombs or that kind of thing. We could load those onto the pylon fitting and the centerline fitting on the airplane. We had the CRV-7 2.5-inch spin stabilized rockets. They were very accurate. And later on, they put the M61 Gatling gun back in the aircraft. Of course, it was a very good weapon as well. We actually never ever got air-to-air missiles on the Starfighter. Actually, I mean, it was certainly capable of doing it. It had the electronics to do it, but when I was there, we never had that. And so the weapons were, rockets, 20 millimeter cannon, thumb bombs, 500 pounders, 1,000 pounders, and napalm. That's what we practiced doing.
And was the role going to be like interdiction?
Yeah, interdiction, close air support, that kind of thing.
How long were you doing that, and then what's the next stage in your career?
Well, I did that in Cold Lake for 2.5 years or thereabouts, almost 3 years. And then I got out of the Air Force about 8 years and 10 days after I joined, and joined Canadian Pacific Airlines. the Air Force was really contracting at that point, and there weren't too many attractive posting options at that point. When I came up for posting, there were 3 postings offered, and one was as an exchange pilot to the U.S. Navy Test Pilot School in Pax River, Maryland. I didn't have the education for that. I couldn't even spell calculus. And then another one was an exchange position with the Royal Australian Air Force on Mirage 3s at Williamtown in Australia. And one of the other guys got that. And then they were going to send me recruiting in Calgary. And at that time, the airlines were hiring. And I said, I don't think I want to settle around for 3 years and be a recruiting officer. So off I went to the airlines and spent 35 years as an airline pilot with Canadian Pacific Airlines on the West Coast in Vancouver. The climate is much more benign than Cold Lake, Alberta, let me tell you.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you're flying at a slightly higher level than would have been.
Yes, and going interesting places and working with great people. I really enjoyed that. My epiphany, Ian, was I was in Cold Lake in February, and I forget why I had to do it, but I had to take a T-33 from Cold Lake to Victoria on Vancouver Island. And going across the Rocky Mountains in February is like going from Siberia to, say, southern Spain. It's the difference in climate is quite a bit. So anyway, when you're flying out of a Cold Lake in February and it's 25 below 0 Celsius, and the poor corporal on the ladder is stopping you in, and when you fly up in that part of the world in a single engine airplane, it involves a lot of padding and survival gear that you're wearing, so you're pretty bulky. There's a lot of goose down and mucklucks and big padded gloves. So the poor corporal, it's like trying to stuff a pillow into a shoebox and then close the lid. So I put the canopy down and, I'm strapped in. I take off. I fly across the Rocky Mountains to Vancouver Island, and I land in Victoria. And they gave me taxi clearance over to the Navy side of the base. And the sailor who was marshaling me in was wearing a T-shirt. And I said, okay, that's it. This is it. This is the place for me. So 6 months later, I was out of the Air Force, and I was on the pilot course for Canadian Pacific Airlines.
Right. I mean, it must be a real contrast, from flying fast jets to, flying a large or, a civilian airliner.
Yes, and of course, for the first little while, we didn't have flight engineers in those days. It was a pilot position. So the flight engineer position was your apprenticeship with the airline. So even though you were a pilot, we sat sideways for a good many years before you got into the first officer seat. So one of the things that they did was the flight duty time limitations with Transport Canada were pretty loosey-goosey in those days. And so the airline actually encouraged you to take a side job flying to keep your pilot skills up. And so they encouraged moonlighting. So I got a couple of jobs. One is, as a flying instructor, and then I got into aerobatic training, and I did some rental aerobatic school with a pit special and a decathlon, that kind of thing. But, I always said I really never learned about flying until I started flying low-powered airplanes in the mountains. And that's where you get your flying skills. Not, you don't care about density altitude when you've got an afterburner. My son is in the Air Force. He is a fighter pilot on the Hornet. He's in a ground job right now, but we sit around and we'll have the odd glass of scotch, and I say to him, well, how fast is that? How fast does your airplane go again? And of course, the top speed on the F-18 is about Mach 1.5, and and he comes back with, how much G can you pull? So there's a bit of rivalry there. So my son is in the Air Force, and my grandson is also in the Air Force. He's an engineering officer. So our family is 4 generations of Royal Canadian Air Force.
I'd like to give a special thanks to Bernardo Shaliga, who put me in contact with Alan. He and Alan are volunteers at the Canadian Museum of Flight in Langley, British Columbia, and you can find details at their website, canadianflight.org. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.